and bless your work, subhanAllah. Just a few things I want to mention here.
Yeah,
One, going back to the point you made about the way that cities like Tel Aviv are projected,
yeah,
and in comparison to Gaza. Now, of course, when it's Tel Aviv, people think about industry, think about like growth, and think about like, I went to Auschwitz-Birkenau some years back, and I wrote an article about my experience. And we stayed in Krakow. Krakow is the cultural hub of Poland, and it took us on a bus from Krakow to Auschwitz. Anyway, on the way, we passed through a town or village called Oswegen, I think it was called. And they said that Oswegen was like this industrial hub during the Nazis. And it was like a cover of what's happening in Auschwitz. So people wouldn't expect uh, there to be such a place as Auschwitz once they're seeing the beauty and history of Sweden.
yeah,
And I thought that's quite profound, really, because that's how the world works. There's always a buffer and a hiding of perpetration of such evils, and they cloak it and they hide it around civility, normality, growth, prosperity. And Tel Aviv is like that because once they show Tel Aviv, they say Tel Aviv is like this beautiful place of industry growth. But in comparison to, let's say, Gaza, now Gaza was also beautiful as well. Gaza had hospitals, had universities, had schools, had infrastructure, had homes, all this stuff. But now when you see Gaza and you see Gaza flattened and you see Gaza destroyed, that's the image people associate with life in Gaza. We don't see a pre-Gaza. They don't show us like what Gaza was once before. They don't show those images of prosperity, of progress, of like, human worth, of capital. They don't show that image. They only show the image of destruction, Gaza. It's like that I have this section, I think might be on being human or navigating war. I have a comparison with in England you had uh, a block of flats that was burnt down called Grenfell Towers. You might remember when it happened, and it was a very bad management of the maintenance of the building and the cladding that was involved in this, and a lot of people died. They were burnt alive, and many Muslims. In fact, the whole complex housed, Muslims, Asians, and many died in that fire. It's an ongoing investigation until today. It's ongoing, uh, but one of the famous artists wrote a song about Grenfell, and I cite the lyrics of the song in my book, and he says something like, uh, like a bedroom that once was, where which once was, and it goes back to understanding how events look like once upon a time in the past, and how we make the comparison with what events look like in the future. But if you forget the past, if we forget what things once were, you'll forget the element of humanity involved. In my book on being humanized, I quote uh, S. Yizhar, author of Kirbet Kizeh. Now, S. Yizhar is a pen name. His book Kirbet Kizeh is a village in Palestine, and this is an Israeli S. Yizhar who was very much against the brutalization levied against the Palestinians, and his book is historic fiction, but it's looking at the Nakba 1948 and the way that Israeli occupying Zionist soldiers, destroyed a village called Kirbet Kizeh. In his book, he writes about this, and he says that these Zionist invaders are entering someone else's home, and he says, yeah, but the walls would cry, the walls would speak. He said, wouldn't the walls speak? He says, wouldn't they see how the feminine touch has placed ornaments around the room? This is the human experience involved in creating a domestic setting. And so he makes that connection in his book, Kirbet Kizeh, as does the artist in the song on Grenfell. But the point is true. So you might see, therefore, progress, the artificial lens of progress on the one hand, but you're not seeing the destruction on the other hand, or you're not seeing the crimes perpetrated against that same, uh, it's like, for example, Otobenga. Now, when you have, for example, if you think about the fact that you had human zoos, uh, and that's just like beginning of 20th century, if I recall.
Mm.
You had in New York and you had Otubenga, but the projection of seeing America as a land of progress and freedom and all these wonderful things, and that in comparison to the fact that they're housing human zoos is a very big betrayal of that so-called notion of progress, civility on the one hand. So people could hide behind the cloak of industrial progress and civility and championing freedom of rights and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, they're involved in a mass killing or rape or slavery against another people. Now that was played out, in fact, like you mentioned, I have a chapter on this, on the killing of Abeer Al-Janabi and her entire family in a place called Mahmoudiyah in Iraq in 2006. So on March 12th of that year, Stephen Green was the main culprit soldier, and there were five others, if I remember, four others, uh, Dan Baker and others, and they all had this plan of raping this girl, Abeer, and then killing her. Uh, but what had happened is that they all went on that day. They separated Abeer from her family, her father Hamza Al-Janabi, her mother Fakhriya Al-Janabi, her sister Hadil Al-Janabi was very small, 7 years old, and they separated them in a room and put Abeer was 14 years old in another room. They all took turns in raping her. They killed the entire family, shot them all dead. Then they killed her, Abeer, and they doused the family and the house in petrol, and they burnt the whole house, and then they fled. These people were caught. They were caught, and Stephen Green uh, kills himself. He hangs himself in prison sometime after being sentenced. Um, I wrote a whole chapter about what happened and how it was shown in American media, the Mahmoudiyya killing. Stephen Green said, I never saw the Iraqis as humans. He makes that line. I never saw the Iraqis as humans. So they would call them Hajjis. So we see Hajjis as an honorific title to a person who performed the Hajj. They would see Hajjis as a dehumanizing label. Like Hajji is like an inferior person. Hajji is like a backward person. And but what really propelled my research in this topic is the way in which Abeer, who was 14 years old, time and time again on American media, it was said that she was 25 years old. 25 years old is a woman, right? So on major newspapers in America, on the all of this in media, it's saying she is 25. And months later, it corrects it and says she was 14. But by that time, the damage is done. People understand that this is a rape and a murder of a woman. A woman and a child is different. A
Yeah.
child and a woman, right? A child, a girl and a woman. These are different, the way that we perceive them. But this is how they show that. Now, of course, in Abeer's case, it went against the dominant narrative of Americans as saviors. Americans going to save Iraq. It went against the whole savior ethos. I went against it because it shows American soldiers as completely evil and as evil and rapists and murderers who did that to that poor girl and her family. And so, as a way of covering up the whole thing, they consigned the Abeer story to small articles and papers down. And by the way, I show all this stuff in my book. The way that sometimes the story is placed next to a bigger story about Remember 9/11,
Yeah.
or all the stories placed next to a woman in swimwear, for example. So they kind of deliberately cover up the whole gravity of the story in American media. Um, but of course, it's those who, and then of course you have this humanizing element of blogs like Abeer Memorial, Daily Cost was one of them, and they tried to rehumanize the experience of Abeer. I
Mm.
make this point, and I said, look, in American consciousness, you have like Danny Pearl, I think his name was, Danny Danny Pearl, who was kidnapped and executed by someone in Pakistan, by some group, but he becomes Dan. So the way the word remembers him is like Danny Pearl becomes the Dan, but Abeer can never become the Abbey. Abeer won't become the Abbey.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, you won't have the association of personalizing Abeer's story. You won't have Abeer's personality. Then what I do is I go through. So if I show you in the book, I have I have pictures in the book. So so for example, this lost uh, like this is one. This is Fallujah. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, can you see that?
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
see that the doll head on the pole?
Yes. SubhanAllah.
This is kind of like these are like this is from Anja Nigel Hawes, who was a war correspondent who was killed accidentally, by the way, in Afghanistan. So I had to buy the photos from a third party source, not from her and her institution, to get access to them. And you'll find like there's more of a truthfulness because you wouldn't find that picture in state media. You're never ever going to see that picture.
Never.
It's not going to be there. And so likewise, if you look at Abeer, like the way that the Abeer, I'll show you now. 1 second. Yeah, this is Abeer. Now this is Abeer, okay, but this is when she was 7. This is the only surviving photograph we have of Abeer.
Wow.
This is what this is it. So we don't see Abeer as 14 or as 6 or 5. This is the only image available of Abeer. This one, okay. Now together with this, so if you look, this image is of the room where she was killed, but you won't see that picture.
Yeah, of course not.
You won't see it. You won't see it. Okay. So I had to get this picture. Now this is a room. So if you see, for example, this is the whole family. These are their passports. Abeer and her parents and Hadil, all of them over here. All right. So now this was a very intense process of dehumanizing her and her family to therefore thereafter trump up the dominant narrative of Americans as saviors. And sometimes it's obscuring like the suffering with images of chaos, like I mentioned before. So whenever they show Iraq, it's like Iraq is uh, is like there's always a truck bombing or suicide bombing, and there's smoke and flames. So when these things happen, they're simply supposed to happen in that landscape.
Exactly.
But they don't show the other side. They don't show the effect of the killing on the cultural makeup of Iraq or of the family. They don't see. You don't see the mourning processes. You don't see the crying. You don't see that. And so what you would see, therefore, in other landscapes of Virginia Tech, for example, school shootings in America, you wouldn't see in the context of Iraq. And the same is true with Gaza. The same is true, of course. Now, it's the same kind of thing being played out across the board, whatever you find, this dominant narrative versus uh, the dehumanized one. Now, I would say lastly that in order to create an other entity, you have to trump up the self. Remember, it's self versus otherness.
Yes.
So the other can't exist without the self.
Exactly.
So other is a consequence of the self. Whenever you find, it's a very good book called The Terror Dream
Mhm.
by Susan something. It was written after 9/11. It's about the way that Americans rely on this exceptionalism, right? That kind of like they live in a certain Superman kind of persona, particularly after 9/11. And in order to justify a killing of innocent people, they have to first show themselves to be extraordinary and full of great values and ethics and goodness, and in order and therefore that whatever they see of evil or badness is imputed on somebody else. That's the other entity, and that then becomes just like, for example, you transfer the worst of your human self onto the other in order to show that other is not like us, has to be executed or deserve to be killed or whatever. But the self is preserved because the self is honorific and is good and civil and so on and so forth. So all of these things are kind of played out in a discourse of dehumanization.